Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lee Henry, and on today's show we have Andrew Scoble. Andrew is a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. And through his work at RAND, and previously as a university professor, Andrew is focused largely around the issue of China, its rise, its nature, and what it means for the world. And so he joins the podcast today to talk about this and how it relates to North Korea, the only country in the world today with an explicit defense agreement with China. But Andrew comes at this from a slightly different direction. People tend to see the North Korean question in relationship to China as that of a big brother. China simply supporting and carrying through North Korea because North Korea are giving China something it needs in the world. This is a friendly, open and warm relationship. But this misses almost entirely the predicament that China are in. On their border is literally a radioactive country and a radioactive crisis. And a country that since its inception has been threatening China through its own collapse. That is, North Korean crises will flow into Chinese territory and into the Chinese political domain. This runs back to the Korean War, but it also speaks to the current crisis of missiles and nuclear weapons. Regime collapse inside North Korea would spark massive migrant flows across the Yalu River and open up the dangerous prospect of loose nukes and rogue generals. But in a much broader context, and this in some ways touches in the current diplomatic moment and the summit talks, North Korea have brought America onto the Chinese doorstep, the world superpower. And they not only brought their troops, but their military hardware and the most aggressive spin-offs of their foreign policy. China needs stability in North Korea, and North Korea has rarely ever given it to them. And in many ways, much of the engagement that China has given them over the years has been to try and secure just this. This is North Korea in many ways leveraging their own weakness against a much stronger country. And for the broader picture, this is a much stronger country that is trying to now re-emerge into the world. Through an expansive military policy, it is reclaiming islands in the South China Sea, pushing through land disputes, and seeking deeper military alliances around the world, while at the same time developing the Belt and Road Initiative and other related economic policies, whereby in many ways China are trying to bring the world into its orbit, create an economic interdependence. But of course the fear is for many people that such an interdependence cannot be equal, and therefore over time this is a means for China to dominate the region. Just how accurate this vision is, I will let Andrew explain, but it is also a fascinating lens for which to view the North Korean problem. Now this podcast is slightly shorter than normal, simply based on the time constraints we had, and so in some ways it is a little scattergun. Through my questions, I am consciously trying not to linger too long on certain areas, so that with Andrew we can cover as much bases as possible. And though this might not be ideal, this is such a broad topic and such a broad policy area to look into that no matter how long this podcast was, we would have always struggled for time. So in recognition of that, I am going to link below this podcast a number of relevant articles of Andrew's. I encourage listeners to go and read them for themselves and thereby gain a slightly wider view on things. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener, and you can support it in various ways. You can donate directly at the Patreon account or the PayPal link attached below, or you can simply share, comment, or like this podcast on social media. All the help is appreciated. On that, and to walk us through China's relationship with North Korea, this is Andrew Scoble. Andrew Scoble, welcome to the Career Now podcast.
Thank you.
So we're going to be speaking about China and China's relationship with North Korea. And instead of doing a deep history, I think it might be best just to launch ourselves into the crux of this, because it's one of those issues that may be easier to expand and develop from the inside out. And through a lot of your writing, from what I've found here, you've got a very interesting view on China's relationship with North Korea, and a view that many people out there in the community probably instinctively doubt, but don't have good reason to do so. So let's begin with the idea that China has a good relationship with North Korea. And you've written a number of things through some of your articles here, and you basically said that it is Pyongyang, against what people have thought, has been a constant headache, a constant thorn for China over the years. So I might get you just to expand that a little bit. Why has Pyongyang been this problematic?
Well, let me just start by saying, actually, surprisingly, today, I would say China's relationship with North Korea is pretty good. But it certainly hasn't always been that way. That's a relatively recent development. And China has been, I wouldn't say it's exactly joined at the hip, but intertwined. China's fate's been intertwined with that of North Korea's since at least 1950. And from China's perspective, as you mentioned, North Korea has been a more or less constant headache, or certainly a constant concern. And that starts from the Korean War when China was sucked in and expended blood and treasure. And Chinese troops were there until inside North Korea until 1958. And in 1963, China was signed a alliance treaty with North Korea, coincidentally the same year that, or not coincidentally, I should say, the same year that North Korea signed a similar treaty with the Soviet Union. And really, even though China, it perhaps strains credulity for many people that China, being such a large country, can be manipulated or, in a sense, I think it is manipulation by a small, such a small country as North Korea. And yet that, I think, has been the case. Successive North Korean leaders have been very good at playing countries off against each other, whether it was during the Cold War, against being mainly China and the Soviet Union, or in the post-Cold War era, North Korea has been quite good at balancing the U.S., South Korea, Japan off against China. So this idea that North Korea or China has had a good relationship with North Korea, or that North Korea benefits China, is a asset for China, I think is fundamentally misunderstanding the situation, because it really, as I said, from the Korean War on, it has been a headache for China. More recently, the nuclear issue has been a challenging one for China, whereas China sees North Korea as a multi-dimensional challenge. Countries such as the United States have seen North Korea in recent decades as primarily the nuclear issue, and whether initially it was how do we prevent North Korea from nuclearizing, achieving a nuclear program, to today where it's how do we get North Korea to denuclearize. And certainly China is concerned about the nuclear issue. China would prefer to have a denuclearized North Korea. But for China, it's much more than that. The Chinese are fond of saying there are three no's where North Korea is concerned. First, there should be no war, no instability, and denuclearization. And I think for many years, even though denuclearization was important for China, the no war, the no instability have been of higher priority. But about 3 or 4 years ago, I think the Chinese leadership concluded that, I guess that Americans would say is a blinding flash of the obvious, but from a Chinese perspective, it was a significant realization, and that is, you really cannot have lasting peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula if you don't have a denuclearized North Korea. So that's I think an important evolution in Chinese thinking.
So on that point there, how important has this leverage been? Is it I suppose, not so much an existential fear, but just a fear of insecurity from the Chinese side around perhaps regime collapse or loose nukes, and these ideas that sort of this idea that North Korean problems can quickly become their problems? Or is it also, and I've sensed this largely through a lot of writing out there in the media these days, that a lot of the worry for the Chinese side is rather what it brings in response from America. That is, America and American troops are on the peninsula and concerned about the peninsula, which has been referred to as the doorway to China. And they're there because of North Korea. And that is one of the great concerns that China have had. And of course, one of the issues recently that came up in the past few years has been the implementation of these THAAD missile defense systems in South Korea, which China have been quite concerned about themselves.
Yes. So China is, and Xi Jinping in particular, the president of China, have been very, very frustrated with North Korea and the current leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. So there's certainly no loss there, and there's a tremendous amount of frustration and anger directed at Pyongyang, and so to that extent. Chinese see North Koreans as being at fault. However, the broader context of this is from a Chinese perspective it's about the United States, and I think China, from a U.S. perspective, successive administrations have come into office and looked at the North Korea problem. Conducted a policy review that's taken many months, often taken many months, and at the end of that policy review period, the administration decides, the key to the problem is China, and so if we only get China on board, then we can solve, then we can start to begin to address and solve the North Korea problem. And successive administrations have been disappointed that China has not been done what Washington has hoped it would. And on the Chinese side, you see a similar dynamic, what I call outsourcing the problem, so that the U.S. conclusion is, because China is North Korea's most important supporter and provider of energy and food and so on, that China, if you get China on board, then we can make progress on the North Korea problem. From a Chinese perspective, as I mentioned, yes, North Korea is troublesome, but if the key to the problem is getting the United States to be more reasonable on the North Korean issue. And so, in a nutshell, what the Chinese position, as they make their case routinely to the United States, is, look, the North Koreans really do want to make a fundamental change. They do want to do a China, in essence. They want to reform their economy and open themselves to the outside world. So why aren't they doing that? The Chinese answer is it's because the United States has not adopted a more accommodating it hasn't moderated its position on North Korea. So the North Koreans feel intimidated, they feel threatened by the United States. And so the solution to the problem, or the beginning to address the North Korean problem, is for the United States to adopt a more moderate, less threatening position towards North Korea. And then North Korea will be able to moderate its position, become less militarized, and embrace economic reform and opening to the outside world.
So I'm glad you touched on it there. The idea that comes in this back and forth between America and China in this regard. And I suppose the idea of mutual distrust, or at least that either one is not playing the game as they should. And this might be an interesting way to talk about the rise of China and what China means for the region as a whole, because there is a feeling around there that China are an expanding aggressive military power. And of course, the line from the Chinese themselves is just the opposite, that they are in fact doing this for the greater good of the broader community. They are trying to help the not just the countries of the region, but countries around the world, often developing countries. And they have these initiatives out there, like the Belt and Road Initiative and things like this, but they're also reclaiming islands in the South China Sea and imposing these, these no-go zones inside the sea as well. So I might get you to have a quick look at that. I know it's a hard thing to have a quick look at, I suppose, but there is a line that comes through that I found in your writing here that many people wouldn't automatically think of when it comes to China. And as you said, China has always viewed itself as a vulnerable, underdeveloped country. And that might be a good way to begin to explain what China is trying to do in the world and China's rise.
Yeah. Well, when you say the region, the Asia Pacific region, or the region formerly known as the Asia Pacific region, now known as the Indo-Pacific region, China sees the Asia Pacific as its neighborhood, and understandably, and a region that it historically, going back centuries, tended to dominate, not necessarily by controlling or conquering all the territories and countries that surround it, but dominate it culturally, diplomatically, and that ties into Xi Jinping's strategy of national rejuvenation. So it's reclaiming China's past greatness. Now, when you read Chinese writings by scholars, analysts, and press Chinese analysts and scholars on, so what does that mean? Going back to making China great again. I use that term on purpose because it's, that kind of rhetoric resonates in countries around the world, especially countries, great powers that have had glorious pasts. And it's hard to think of too many other countries out there that have that great civilization and greatness in their past that China does. So what exactly that making China great again really means, or national rejuvenation, is cloaked in ambiguity. But certainly China believes that it has every right to be the dominant power in the Asia Pacific. And to the extent that the United States is seen as impeding that China's rise to reclaim past greatness, to reclaim its rightful place in the Asia Pacific, that the United States is seen as threatening. And so when China looks out and sees when China looks out at the region and the world, it sees itself surrounded, or largely surrounded, by U.S. allies and partners, and the U.S. military either being based or operating almost unfettered throughout the entire region, and that is, from China's perspective, perceived as threatening. The Chinese like to say that the Cold War is over, And these U.S. alliances, whether it's NATO or U.S. alliances with Japan and South Korea, they are remnants of the Cold War. They're no longer needed. If you have an alliance, there must be, if you think there's a reason to have a continued alliance or alliance system, then you must think there are enemies out there. Who is the enemy? Of course, the Chinese conclude that, deduce that it's China that the U.S. thinks is the enemy. And that's not such a surprising conclusion when you read the Trump administration's national security strategy. It pretty clearly identifies who the major threats are, and of course there are multiple. But at the top of the list is China, and then Russia. So that's from a Chinese perspective, the U.S. is the adversary or the potential adversary, or certainly the U.S. and China are engaged in a rivalry. And when you talk about other countries, I think the biggest concern of other countries in the Asia Pacific that they fear being caught between China and the United States, or more specifically, they fear being forced to choose between one or the other, because I think most countries would prefer to be in the U.S. orbit in terms of diplomatic and security arrangements, but most of them are in China's orbit economically. So they're caught in the middle, and what they really would prefer to do is not be forced, as I said, not be forced to choose sides. So it pretty much, let's see, about 10 years ago, and roughly coinciding with the global financial crisis, when countries, especially the United States, seem to be, their economies seem to be much more fragile, much weaker than many assumed. By contrast, China seemed to be much stronger, much more resilient. And as a result of that, countries started to reassess how their geopolitics and their position in the world. China internally, as a result of the crisis, and their assessment was that the U.S., consistent with the assessments that other countries reached, that the United States was starting to weaken, and it was in decline, even if it was a slow decline. And China's star was continuing to rise, and in fact, it was time for China to claim, be respected, be more respected, and have its views taken into account, especially what it viewed as its sphere of influence in the Asia Pacific. So as a result of that, China began acting more assertively, speaking more stridently, and this was perceived, this was alarming to many countries, this was worrying to the United States, that this was interpreted not as China being more assertive, but China being more aggressive. And that was worrying for many countries, and that tone, of China being much more pushy, demanding, was very jolting to many in the Asia Pacific and even beyond. So China has long recognized that countries out there perceive China as threatening, or can perceive China as threatening, and this is often seen as unjustified, and yet Chinese leaders have recognized this problem exists, and so tried to formulate initiatives, attempts to try and counter that China threat, what they call a China threat school. So relatively with mixed success. I think one of the most important successes they've been somewhat more successful in recent years, and one of the reasons is the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road, is, I think, fundamentally misunderstood. But nevertheless, from a Chinese perspective, there are multiple goals. But one of them really is to counter that China threat school, to promote and depict China as an economic opportunity for everyone, and to the emphasis on economic development, Chinese assistance, Chinese investment, Chinese development of infrastructure to many countries who have very poor infrastructure. Of course, there are other reasons driving this. It's also important from a Chinese perspective as a way to continue to stimulate Chinese economic growth. But this the Belt and Road has been used as a propaganda mechanism to emphasize that China has benevolent intentions, and to emphasize that the Chinese mantra of win-win mantra, that China's rise can benefit all countries.
So that might be an interesting way to wind this back to North Korea, at least slightly. That idea of the Belt and Road Initiative and China's, I suppose, a new way to see their rise inside the world. But as people have seen throughout the world, there has also been a concern out there that this is just another way for China to dominate by different means, as in engage with us in economic terms. We can dominate you through these economic terms. When we hit problems and infrastructure challenges or loan repayments can't come in, we can gain more and more leverage over you. And this is a mechanism to walk deeper inside a country. So that is one of the fears that people have out there. But this is, of course, a fear that people have had about, I suppose, the rise of most countries around the world when they've risen like this. But in the North Korean sense, is this fear in any way justified? Because there is China is North Korea's largest trading partner. In many ways, its only significant trading partner. And I wonder what you make of China's growing influence, if indeed they have any, through this economic process that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, so you're right. China is the dominant economic partner of North Korea, and the North Koreans are painfully aware of that. So there is the North Koreans are very suspicious and distrustful of outsiders, and that includes China. So while China has been, in many ways, North Korea's most reliable friend, the North Koreans do not trust the Chinese, and they're very uncomfortable at being so heavily reliant on China. So I think an important part of Kim Jong-un's diplomatic offensive, his charm offensive, his summit diplomacy over the last year or so, last 12 months or so, has been to really broaden out from China. It is significant, though, that the most Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un have had I think it's five summits. That's more summits than Kim has had with any other leader. So I think that underscores that North Korea recognizes that it must maintain a good relationship with China, must placate China, must consult with China. But the North Koreans really want to broaden out, to diversify their economic relationships. They really are keen to have more expand their economic relationship with South Korea, and of course the United States. And I think they'd also like to do that with Japan. We don't really have good hard data on the actual extent of China's trade with North Korea or Chinese investment in North Korea, but we do know the trends, and the trends have been increased growth in China's investment in North Korea. And unlike South Korean investment and economic activity in North Korea over the last decade or two, China's investment involvement has been spread throughout North Korea, whereas South Korea has been the Kaesong complex has been an important has been an important focus. The Mount Kumgang tourist zone. So the North Koreans have pushed the South Korean economic investment and activity, tried to contain it in specific zones, whereas the Chinese they've not been able to contain China's economic activities, and so it's been spread all over the country. Some large investments, but also smaller Chinese business efforts across North Korea, and so it does potentially set the stage for China to dominate the North Korean economy and become the largest creditor in North Korea. Now, what might that mean, or what do the current trends mean, and what if that were to happen? What would that mean? I think it's really unclear what that would mean. The North Koreans are pretty good about turning what appears to be a weakness into a strength. So whether that would mean that increased Chinese influence in North Korea, or whether that might mean that North Korea actually has China over a barrel, that China might be in so deep that the North Koreans actually have it's the North Koreans that actually have the leverage over China. Difficult to say, but one thing's for sure is that, as I said, North Korea would much prefer to diversify its economic relations beyond China.
So on that point there, I have to get your take here on Jangsong Tech, which is, of course, for people who are unaware, this is Kim Jong-un's uncle, I suppose former uncle, who he had executed. And this was such a shock, not just because of the relationship to the leader, but also because of how powerful Jang was inside North Korea, but also his relationship with China. For many people, he was the key broker between these two countries, and many people saw him potentially, though this is often a worn-out phrase, as another Deng Xiaoping kind of character, someone who could open North Korea up to a new economic prosperity. And Kim Jong-un had him executed in quite brutal fashion. Now, I wonder how you saw this happening, because as you said recently, the relationships have, well, at least seems to have improved between China and North Korea as a result of a whole series of summits as well. But if we just wind back a few years, it seemed to be going in the absolute opposite direction. So I might get to your take on the Jangsong Tech situation.
Okay. Now, first, there's been, I think, two points. First is that, as I alluded to earlier, a lot of significant paranoia and suspicion and distrust of outside influences in North Korea. And since China, not surprisingly, a lot of that's been directed at China because China's loomed so large for North Korea over the decades. And going back to at the end, the aftermath of the Korean War, Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, was very concerned about establishing or limiting Chinese influence, and he purged large numbers of North Koreans who were linked to China, the so-called Yan'an faction. And of course, Yan'an was the wartime capital of the Chinese Communist Party. Wartime meaning the not the Korean War, but the Chinese Civil War and the war against during the Second World War against Japanese occupation. So there were ethnic Korean communists who spent time in Yan'an, fought and worked alongside their Chinese communist counterparts, and they were released by Mao and sent to North Korea and so they became part of the North Korean regime, the North Korean armed forces, and they were very useful during the period of the Korean War. But afterwards, Kim Il-sung sought to purge these. So it's not a history lesson. It's the point is that there's this enduring concern about Chinese influence, and fast forward to the current decade, Chang Song-taek was seen, I think, from Kim Jong-un's perspective, as too much, as a pawn, or if not a pawn, then certainly much too influenced by China, and so that was part of the concern. But I think also the second point is that Kim Jong-un surprised everyone, I think, by being much more astute as a power broker and a Machiavellian figure who was able to solidify his hold on power. And so if you are, I think that the best way to describe the North Korean political system is as a totalitarian regime. Now, it ain't perfect because the regime doesn't completely control everything, but it does try very hard to, and it comes as close as the world has today, anything being described as a totalitarian regime. So in a totalitarian regime, you can only have one leader, one absolute all-powerful leader. And so there's no room for, even if an uncle, even if he is a kindly uncle or an uncle who's supportive of you, he is seen as a threat or a challenge. And so that's the reason that Kim Jong-un got rid of his uncle. Two main reasons, and it's a powerful signal. If you're young, relatively inexperienced, seen as relatively inexperienced, and still building your strength up, and yet you are able to go after, you have no qualms about executing your own uncle. What is that? That shows that you are ruthless, you are brutal, and you are not someone to be trifled with. So it's a very powerful signal to send out within the North Korean political system, but it also there's also a subtle message to outsiders, including China, that you are in control, and you will not, you being Kim Jong-un, will not brook any untoward outside influence.
Now, I know you have places to run to, so I'm not going to keep you much longer, but just as a final question before you leave, I must ask you your thoughts and how you see this relating from the Chinese side of the recent summit, or what are perceived to be the recent summit breakdown, because as you mentioned there, I suppose throughout this interview, China in many ways needs a stable North Korea. The idea of regime collapse and nuclear weapons is a concern for them, not just from what it brings, but also because it brings America into the table. But the summit breakdown in many ways would, for people who've been watching this from the outside, be quite concerning in regard that you may have a return to the missile launches and the maximum pressure scenarios there. But on the other side of this, it also seems quite concerning for China as well. If in fact you had just by sheer good luck, a very peaceful reunification, this could be quite concerning for China too in many ways, as in you could have a non-divided Korean peninsula could also be quite a concern for them for what the new regime might look at. So how do you see the Chinese view from the summits and how this will proceed into the future?
Okay, I think China. I mean, there's no. It's not a coincidence that China's relations with North Korea have improved dramatically since early over the last 12 months. And so the question is why. I think the answer is that Kim Jong-un decided to launch his charm offensive, going back to the Winter Olympics last year in South Korea, and what I call, the season of summits, his series of summits with South Korea's leader, with China's leader, and then of course with the president of the United States. And so that moderating of North Korea's policy, its decision to halt, at least temporarily halt testing of nuclear weapons and missiles. This was very much welcomed by China, and so the Chinese are very happy with the dramatic decline in tension on the Korean Peninsula. So they're very happy about that. And they were quite hopeful that these summits, specifically the summit last year in Singapore between Kim Jong-un and President Trump, that would lead to further progress on and meaningful change towards continued decline in tensions and greater improvement in relations between the U.S. and North Korea. So that seemed to be there was a very good feeling of optimism and positivity that came out of the Singapore summit, even though there weren't really any tangible, concrete outcomes. But in further hope, this February that the Hanoi summit would lead to more tangible results. And so from that, obviously that didn't happen, and that was a source of frustration and disappointment on the part of China. So I think the Chinese are still trying to conduct a postmortem on why it happened and what this means for the region, for North Korea, for what the trends are, and then to the extent that it's just human nature, people do this. Why didn't the summit conclude in a more successful fashion? And it's just, as I said, human nature to look around and start pointing the finger. And I think there's some blame from the Chinese perspective to be assigned to North Korea, but also blame to the United States. And going back to what we were speaking about earlier, that the assumption that in Beijing, that because the United States is a superpower, is far more powerful than North Korea, that the onus is on Washington to be more compromising, to be more reassuring, and to that extent, from a Chinese perspective, the Trump administration failed to deliver in Hanoi, and this is a tremendous disappointment. And with the recent statements and coming out of Pyongyang, there's concern in China that what the future might hold, and there are tremendous question marks about what the road ahead, where North Korea and the Korean Peninsula is concerned, where that leads. And as you mentioned, the Chinese, I think, see the Korean Peninsula as the gateway or the doorway to China. And in fact, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has actually used that term, Menkou. And so this I think underscores how sensitive the Korean Peninsula is from a Chinese perspective, and how vulnerable China feels to the prospect, the reality, actual instability, or the prospect of continued instability in the future on the Korean Peninsula is in their geostrategic thinking.
So that's a great place to leave this on. And I've already kept you longer than I said I would, and I am well aware for people listening that in some cases we may have briefed over things, but I'm going to provide a list below this podcast of people interested of Andrew's work. Please go there and read some of the articles and read a lot of the links that I'm going to provide below. They will flesh out a lot of the details here, which is just impossible to really dig into too much of them in the time that we have. So on that, Andrew Skobel, thanks for coming on the Career Now podcast.
You're welcome. Thank you.